are going to dive into a brand new topic inside of our Photoshop Basics for Scrapbooking class. This month and next month, we're going to be focusing on photos and all of the different things that we can do in terms of editing and cropping and all of that fun stuff to do with photography inside of both Photoshop Creative Cloud and Photoshop Elements. Today's lesson, we're going to focus on the base level, the basics of photo editing, primarily looking at brightening, contrast, exposure, and black and white. So let's go ahead over to my computer screen and get started. All right, friends, we are over here at my computer screen, and first up, we're going to be working inside of Photoshop Creative Cloud. For the remainder of our Photoshop classes, I'm actually going to remove the small secondary video box that would normally show you my face, just because I feel like I want you to be able to see the entire screen, so nothing important gets covered up in the process. So we're just going to be looking at my screen today. Now, today we're working on basic editing for our photos. What I'm going to do first here is go ahead and get a photo opened up. Let's go ahead and work with this one. This is a photo that I took outside in our backyard with the kids and my brother-in-law and my niece all swinging on our playset. Now this photo is a little bit darker than I would like, so typically when I'm working on editing my photos, I always increase my brightness in order to make my photo really more professional looking, and I also will oftentimes increase my contrast to help keep those photo colors looking really punchy. So let's talk about the different adjustments or edits that we can make to the photo. For the basic edits, you're going to find them over here in this Adjustments tab. If you cannot see the Adjustments tab, then you need to go up to the Window menu here at the top and go down to Adjustments. Make sure it's got a little check mark next to it, and then that will pull it up right here on the side. There are going to be 4 basic edits that I'm going to show you today, but we will briefly touch on some of the other ones in here just so you know kind of sort of what they are, but I generally don't use them a whole ton because I find that these other 4 edits get the job done for me. And then I'm also going to take you through some advanced photo edits that can help make your photos look even better outside of these little basic adjustments here at the beginning. So the first one, and the one I use the absolute most, is this first little icon that looks like a half dark and half bright sun. When you click on this one, it is the brightness and contrast adjustment. When you click on it, down below, you're going to have a Properties tab open up that gives you a brightness slider and a contrast slider. At the same time, you may also notice that a new layer has been added into your Layers panel called the Brightness and Contrast 1. It's only given the number 1 because you can add multiple adjustments on top of a photo, and it just will continue the number up. So, once you have the brightness and contrast adjustment clicked, you then can come to these sliders and click and drag this little arrow up and down. The farther up the slider you go, the more washed out and brighter your photo is going to look. The further down the slider you go, the more darkness is going to be added into your photo. So it's going to make it really, really dark with blacks in there, right? For me, I typically like to adjust up and have some brightness added into my photo. As I'm doing this, one thing I try to keep in mind is the subjects of my photo, and in this case, it's all the people. And I want to make sure that they're not being washed out. Primarily Jonah, who has a lot of sun shining on him. If I were to go too high, then his face would become really too bright compared to everybody else's, and it would just look unnatural. So I am going to adjust this up. For me, it's going to be a number 12. If you have an actual number you want to type in here, like I could say 50, and it will go up to 50. But for me, I typically use the slider to figure it out myself. The next one down here is the contrast. Now, the higher you go on the contrast, the more burnt your photo is going to look, and the further down you go on the contrast slider, the more washed out your photo is going to look. For this one, I also typically like to increase my contrast, not as much as my brightness, but enough to really give a little bit of punch to my colors to make them not so muted. So I will go up maybe about almost halfway, maybe a little bit more than halfway this time. And I feel like this looks really good. Right now, my brightness and contrast adjustment is showing up as a separate layer in my layers panel. What this means is I can actually click on this eyeball next to it to turn the layer on and off, so I can see what the original photo looks like and what my now adjusted photo looks like. For me, I typically like to combine my adjustment layers with my photo layer so that I'm just working with the one layer, because I doubt I really will ever want to use it in this form ever again. So to combine all of the layers together, you just need to click on the brightness and contrast, hold the shift button and click on your photo layer so that now they are both selected. Right click and merge visible, and that's going to turn them into one singular file instead of the two that they were before, the two layers that they were before. There is a benefit to keeping them separated because you can remove the adjustment or make further adjustments to the adjustment that you put on there, or you can always have access to the original photo. There's also benefits to having them merged together. It's easier to work with it in terms of cropping and adding it onto a separate file, which is something I will teach you how to do at a later point in time. For now, let's leave it like this. The next adjustment here is the levels adjustment. This is one that I typically do not use. It allows you to adjust the white and the gray and the black. You can slide the white down to add more brightness. You can slide the black up to add more contrast. It's just another way of adding brightness and contrast into your photo. I prefer to use the actual brightness and contrast versus levels, but feel free to play around if you like. For this class, I will just recommend brightness and contrast. It's a little bit more user-friendly. Same with curves. Curves is another adjustment layer that increases contrast and brightness, but in a slightly different way. In this one, you have a square here, like a grid with this line that's going down the middle. This is representing the shadows and highlights, I believe, of your photo. And if you click on the line, you can drag and create a curve that it increases brightness and it increases, so this will increase the brightness or decrease the brightness and increase the contrast. So for this one, typically you want to click on the curve or click on the line and drag it slightly up to increase the brightness. Go further down the line, click and lower it to add back in some contrast. It's a little more finicky. It's a little bit more complex. Again, I still prefer to use the brightness and contrast, so I typically don't use curves when I am editing my photos, but again, feel free to play around if that's something you're interested in. The next one here is the exposure. This is an adjustment that I use, but primarily just this, or really singularly just this exposure slider here. So if you, again, click and drag, it's going to increase your exposure or decrease your exposure, right? So you get either white or black. For this one, I will oftentimes adjust my brightness and contrast first, and then I will come into exposure and also increase my exposure, because exposure doesn't add any real color into my photo, whereas brightness sometimes adds a little bit of yellow in. So if I adjust it to the point where, if I adjust my brightness and contrast to the point where I am happy with the way everybody is looking, I can then come in here and adjust the exposure to brighten my photo up even more. So here is an example. If I go down here to my layers panel, I can turn this off and you can see that is brightening up, especially around the outside of this photo, and it just makes it look a whole lot better. So let's go ahead. I'm going to combine those together again to one layer. All right. Vibrance is something that we're going to cover a little bit later, but this is to increase the vibrance or saturation of your colors inside of your photo. Same with hue and saturation. This allows you to identify colors and increase how much they are present inside of your photo. Not one that I use very much. Whoops. So we'll go ahead and move on from that. Color balance, we're also going to talk about a little bit later in a different advanced editing lesson. But the last one I do want to talk about here inside of this current lesson, our basic editing, is black and white filter. So if you want to make the photo that you're working with black and white, you're going to come into your adjustments menu and click on this one that has a half white, half black square. When you click on that, it's going to automatically add this filter that creates a black and white filter for your photo. So it's adjusting things to make your photo black and white. I can again turn this off and back on, or I can combine them into one file if I so choose. When I am working on editing my photos, I typically save my edited photo as a completely different file. So I might save it as, a photo name. So maybe it's like Project Life 2022 week 35 photo 1. And that way my original photo file is not totally overtaken. Like I can go back and use that original file anytime I want. I always save it as something different. All right, so that, my friends, those are the main edits that I want to talk about today. So that's the brightness and contrast, exposure, and black and white. So again, that's the little sun, the plus and minus, and the black and white square. So let's go over to Photoshop Elements and show you how to do the same thing inside of Elements. Okay, so first let's open up that exact same photo. Here we go. Now, inside of Photoshop Elements, there isn't that little window for adjustments. Instead, you're going to go up to this little tiny menu underneath where it says Create, and there is a circle that is half dark and half white. When you click on the circle, it's going to open up a couple of different adjustments that you can make to your photo. In terms of brightness and contrast and increasing the light or decreasing the light, you really only have these two adjustments here. The first one being brightness and contrast. So here's where you're going to find that. When you click on the brightness and contrast, it gives you your second layer, just like it did in Photoshop Creative Cloud, and then you have your two sliders. So you've got the brightness slider, which I can increase up to where it looks good for me, and then the contrast slider that I can again increase until I like the way that it looks. When I have things the way I like it, I can click on the little X. It still stays here in my layers panel. I can either leave them as two separate layers, or I can hold Shift, click on my background, right click, and merge layers if I wish. Okay, the other adjustment that you have inside of Photoshop Elements is the levels. So this one we briefly covered before. It does do essentially exposure, right? So if I take this white little arrow and I move it more towards the middle, it's going to create more light to my photo, so more exposure. I can also click the black one and drag it up, and that's going to give me a little bit more contrast into my photo. So that is a way of adjusting the exposure of your photo. It's a little more complicated. It's a little more, you have to play around with it a whole lot more with this. So it's not necessarily my favorite way of doing exposure, but there is not actually an exposure adjustment that you can easily get to inside of Photoshop Elements. In a couple weeks, we're going to do an advanced editing lesson where I'm going to teach you all about the camera raw filter. Inside of that filter, you can find the exposure slider. It's just a little bit more complicated to get to it, but there is a way, and I actually use the camera raw filter on almost every photo I edit. So it is a space that I definitely am excited to show you more about in the coming weeks. For now, though, inside of Elements, you do have levels that you can play around with, and you also have the brightness and contrast. Similarly to Photoshop Creative Cloud, you are able to add an adjustment or a filter that makes your photo turn black and white, but it is not this time inside of your Adjustments tab. Instead, you're going to go down here to the bottom where there's this menu with layers, effects, filters, styles, and so on, and click on Effects. Inside of Effects, you're going to have this drop-down menu that allows you to look at a lot of different, essentially, photo filters that you can apply to your photo. There's, anything from faded photo, glow, paintings, seasons, vintage. You can see all of them all at once. Or you can also just click on monotone color, which is typically what I have selected. With monotone color, it's going to analyze the colors inside of your photo and adjust them so that they all become one monotone color, depending on what you select. You could select yellow, red, purple, green, blue, or black and white. So here is our black and white filter. When I click on this, it's going to turn my photo black and white. I can go back over to my layers panel, and now you see that those are two separate layers once again. So I can turn the eyeball off and on in order to see the two different photos. If I want them to be one singular file or layer, I can select them both, right click, and merge the visible layers, or merge. You can also say, go back. So we can also say merge layers. Which is a little bit different than merge visible, because visible will merge everything even if you don't have it selected. So merge layers will only merge the things that you have selected when you click on that. All right, friends, that is the basic edits for your photos. For your homework this week, or a task for you to practice, I would love for you to open up a photo in whatever program you have, whether it's Photoshop Elements or Photoshop Creative Cloud, and I want you to test out the 4 basic editing functions. So contrast, brightness, exposure, or levels, I suppose if you have Elements, try out levels and see what you think, and black and white. I want you to play around with all 4 of those until you feel comfortable with making those adjustments. When we return next week, I'm going to show you how to crop and or resize your photos. I also consider this to be basic editing for photography. And then after we cover the cropping and resizing, we're going to get into some more advanced photo editing tasks or adjustments that you can make inside of these 2 programs. So we will get more and more in depth into all of this, but to give you a foundation, those 4 adjustments, brightness, contrast, exposure, and or levels, and black and white, are going to give you a really rock solid foundation. All right, friends, I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that you are learning along the way and excited to dive into these 2 programs. I will be back again next week to share the cropping and resizing video. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I'll catch you